Clark is among a number of participants that's headed to the senior training camp for Team USA. Now, I would assume, right? Oh, they've learned all kinds of lessons after failing to put Caitlin Clark on Team USA during the Olympics. By the way, of which the guy that runs the 2028 Olympics, he come out and said he thought it was a terrible idea leaving her off the team. Adam Silver said, hey, I think this was an opportunity that they could have had to have grown women's sports.
When the most powerful voice in men's basketball suddenly weighs in on a women's Olympic roster decision, you know this story runs much deeper than a simple lineup choice. This wasn't just an eyebrow-raising omission or a debatable coaching call. It was a move that quietly exposed how far behind the decision-makers had fallen and how fast the game itself had outgrown them. What unfolded next wasn't immediate, loud, or obvious. There were no emergency press conferences or public apologies. Instead, the fallout began brewing in the background, in private conversations, tense meetings, and subtle shifts in tone. The people who believed they could ignore a cultural shift and get away with it are now discovering that the sport doesn't wait for anyone, especially not those clinging to outdated thinking. Because leaving Caitlin Clark off the Olympic roster didn't just spark debate, it fractured trust. Fans, players, and even insiders started asking the same uncomfortable question. How could the most influential player women's basketball has seen in decades be considered optional? The official explanation sounded clean and professional, but the more people listened, the less it made sense. This moment drew a clear line between two eras of women's basketball, one rooted in tradition, hierarchy, and how things have always been done, the other driven by visibility, momentum, and a global audience that suddenly couldn't look away. And once that line was drawn, there was no going back. Because what happened after that decision wasn't just backlash, it was accountability. The kind that doesn't announce itself right away, but slowly dismantles the systems that allowed a mistake like this to happen in the first place. And as the dust begins to settle, it's becoming clear that this wasn't just a snub. It was the spark that forced an entire institution to confront the future it tried to ignore. The explanation from the selection committee sounded polished on the surface, but it unraveled the moment people actually thought about it. We were told the decision came down to basketball criteria. Experience mattered, international play mattered, chemistry mattered, popularity, marketability, and outside noise supposedly had nothing to do with it. And that was the first red flag, because in the modern era of global sports, those things are no longer separate. Reading between the lines, the message was clear. The committee believed women's basketball should still be evaluated the same way it was decades ago, as if exposure, reach, and cultural relevance were distractions instead of necessities. They treated the Olympics like a private club for veterans rather than the world's biggest stage, where new stars are introduced to audiences who might never watch another game all year. What made the explanation even harder to swallow was how selectively the criteria seemed to be applied. Caitlin Clark wasn't some untested prospect who had only thrived in college gyms. She had already competed internationally, already worn USA across her chest, and already proven she could perform under pressure against the best young talent in the world. Yet suddenly, that experience was being downplayed or dismissed as if it didn't count. That inconsistency is where frustration turned into skepticism. If the rules can bend depending on who's being evaluated, then they aren't rules, they're cover. And to many fans, it felt like the committee had already made up its mind long before the final conversations ever happened. The most telling part wasn't what they said, but what they refused to acknowledge. There was no recognition that the game itself had changed, no admission that a player could bring value beyond box scores and rotations, no willingness to accept that basketball excellence and cultural impact can exist in the same person. And once that became clear, another uncomfortable thought crept in.
This wasn't just about whether Caitlin Clark fit the roster. It was about whether the people in charge were capable of recognizing the moment they were standing in. Because if they couldn't see it then, the consequences were only a matter of time. The moment didn't come from a press release or a highlight reel. It came quietly from the stands, and that's what made it so powerful. In the middle of the Olympics, a fan from overseas showed up to a Team USA game holding a Caitlin Clark sign, not a Team USA sign, not the name of a reigning gold medalist, one player's name written clearly enough for the world to see. That image traveled fast because it said everything the committee insisted didn't matter. Here was proof that international fans weren't just watching for the flag or the final score. They were tuning in for a player they felt connected to, a player who wasn't even on the floor. On the biggest stage in sports, the star people came to see was sitting at home. This is where the decision stopped being just questionable and started looking short-sighted. The Olympics are supposed to introduce athletes to the world, not hide them from it. They're where casual viewers turn into fans and where sports grow beyond their usual borders. And yet, the one player already pulling global attention toward women's basketball was excluded from the very platform designed for that purpose.
What made it worse was how obvious the business side of it was. Those fans weren't holding signs for nostalgia or tradition. They were signaling demand. They were saying, without words, that they would pay to see Caitlin Clark. That matters in a sport still fighting for equal coverage, better deals, and long-term growth. Ignoring that reality wasn't noble, it was negligent. The sign wasn't just cardboard and ink, it was a warning, a reminder that the audience had already moved on from the old model, even if the leadership hadn't. And while the committee may have brushed it off as noise, others inside the sport saw it for what it really was. Because once international fans start choosing players over programs, the rules change, and the people who refuse to adapt don't stay in control for very long. Any remaining doubt about Caitlin Clark's impact disappeared the moment she stepped into the WNBA. This wasn't a slow build or a gradual adjustment period. It was immediate. Cities that struggled to fill seats suddenly had sellout crowds. Ticket prices spiked the moment her name appeared on the schedule. Games that once flew under the radar became must-watch events overnight. Everywhere the Indiana Fever went, the effect was the same. Arenas felt different, louder, fuller, alive. Fans who had never attended a women's game were lining up, paying premium prices, and staying until the final buzzer. This wasn't organic league growth happening over years. This was a shockwave caused by one player. The television numbers told an even clearer story. Clark's debut drew more viewers than some NBA playoff games airing that same weekend. Networks scrambled to adjust schedules, add broadcasts, and capitalize on a surge they didn't fully anticipate. For the first time in a long time, women's basketball wasn't fighting for attention, it was commanding it. Then came the merchandise. Clark's rookie jersey didn't just sell well, it shattered records. It became the highest-selling jersey in WNBA history, and it did it with room to spare. That's not hype. That's proof of a fan base forming in real time, driven by connection, excitement, and a sense that something historic was happening. On the court, the numbers were just as staggering. In her debut season, she broke 62 records, not small benchmarks or obscure stats, but marks that forced people to reevaluate what was possible. She wasn't just fitting into the league, she was reshaping how the league was experienced. And that's the part no one could explain away. This wasn't media manipulation or casual curiosity. This was sustained attention, real money, and real growth. The entire economic conversation around the WNBA shifted because of her, which made one question impossible to ignore. How could a player capable of changing the league's trajectory be deemed unnecessary on the world's biggest stage? Once the impact became undeniable, the conversation shifted fast. What started as fan frustration turned into open criticism from people whose voices carry real weight in basketball.
Analysts, former players, and insiders weren't arguing hypotheticals anymore. They were calling out a decision that now looked reckless in hindsight. Some didn't bother softening their words. The snub was labeled a disaster, a missed opportunity, and even the worst marketing misstep the sport had ever seen. These weren't casual observers chasing clicks. These were people who understood the business, the culture, and the fragile momentum women's basketball had finally built. And they all saw the same thing. The committee had misread the moment. What made this backlash different was how wide it spread. It wasn't confined to social media or sports talk shows. It spilled into mainstream conversations, podcasts, and interviews where the same question kept surfacing. How could leadership be this out of touch when the evidence was right in front of them? Behind the scenes, things were reportedly far more tense than the public realized. While official statements stayed calm and measured, rumors suggest internal frustration started bubbling almost immediately. Some voices inside USA Basketball allegedly questioned how the decision had been justified so confidently, only to unravel within weeks.
That's when concern quietly turned into panic. Because this wasn't just about optics anymore. Sponsors were watching. Networks were watching. The NBA was watching. The decision didn't just reflect on one committee, it reflected on the entire organization responsible for growing the women's game. And once leadership realized the backlash wasn't fading, but accelerating, it became clear this story wasn't going to end with a simple explanation. Something had to change. The only question was how far the consequences would go. The pressure reached another level the moment Adam Silver spoke up. The NBA commissioner rarely inserts himself into WNBA roster decisions, especially something as sensitive as Olympic selection. So when he publicly criticized the choice to leave Caitlin Clark off the team, it sent a message that couldn't be ignored. This wasn't fan outrage or media noise. This was the highest authority in basketball signaling that a line had been crossed. That kind of commentary carries weight behind closed doors. When the parent organization expresses concern, it forces uncomfortable conversations. Reports claim that Silver's comments accelerated internal discussions that were already simmering. What had been disagreement turned into urgency. Suddenly, leadership wasn't just defending a decision, they were defending credibility. At the same time, the Olympics themselves added fuel to the fire. Team USA advanced, but not without moments that raised eyebrows. The gold medal game was far closer than many expected. Possessions tightened, scoring dried up, and when the pressure peaked, so did the questions. Would a deep shooting threat have changed the dynamic? Would an offense creator like Clark have opened things up when the margins were razor thin? This is where speculation started creeping in, and it couldn't be contained. Reports suggest those same questions were being asked internally, not just on television panels. No one was saying the team didn't deserve gold, but the idea that the outcome had felt fragile lingered in the air longer than anyone wanted. That close call mattered more than people realized. Winning masked a lot, but it didn't erase doubt. It forced leadership to confront an uncomfortable truth. They may have survived the Olympics, but they barely escaped a moment that could have permanently defined the program. And once that realization set in, the fallout from the Clark decision stopped being theoretical. It became a problem that demanded a real solution. Not long after the dust began to settle, the tone started to change. The same voices that once sounded confident grew noticeably more careful. Statements became softer, more conditional, and loaded with qualifiers. Instead of firm explanations, fans began hearing phrases like, "in hindsight," "given how she's playing now," and "high consideration." It was subtle, but it was unmistakable. Key figures tied to the decision slowly tried to create distance between themselves and the outcome. Some emphasized that roster choices were collective, not individual. Others suggested their influence had been overstated. The message was clear. When the backlash intensified, no one wanted full ownership of the call anymore. What stood out most was how the justification shifted.
Rather than defending the original evaluation, the narrative turned into one of timing. The suggestion was that Caitlin Clark had somehow elevated her game after the selection process ended, as if her dominance had arrived unexpectedly. But fans weren't buying it. The numbers were already there. The performances were already documented. Nothing about her rise came out of nowhere. Social media became a timeline of receipts. Side-by-side comparisons of her college dominance and early WNBA performances circulated non-stop. Clips, stats, and dates painted a clear picture. Clark hadn't suddenly become elite. She had always been that player. The difference was that now, ignoring it looked indefensible. Even when admissions came, they stopped short of accountability. There were no outright apologies, no acknowledgement that the criteria itself might have been flawed, just careful language designed to concede as little ground as possible. And to many observers, that reluctance said more than any explanation ever could. Because when leaders can't fully own a mistake, it usually means something bigger is about to give. The announcement didn't come with dramatic flair, but its implications were massive. USA Basketball revealed that the entire selection structure responsible for the Olympic roster decision was being overhauled. Committees that once operated behind closed doors were stripped of their power. The system that allowed responsibility to be spread thin and accountability to disappear was coming apart piece by piece.
This wasn't a minor adjustment or a symbolic gesture. It was a complete philosophical shift. Instead of group votes and layered decision-making, authority would now be centralized. One person would make the calls. One person would answer for them. The same model that had guided the men's national team for years was finally being applied on the women's side. That change alone spoke volumes. Committees are safe. They protect individuals from fallout. When things go wrong, no single person has to stand in front of the criticism. By dismantling that structure, USA Basketball was quietly admitting that the old system no longer worked in a sport evolving at record speed. Then came the name attached to the new role, Sue Bird, 5-time Olympic gold medalist, 4-time WNBA champion, one of the most respected figures the game has ever produced. And most importantly, she wasn't being added to a panel or advisory group. She was being given full authority as managing director of the women's national team. That detail changed everything. Player selection, coaching decisions, direction of the program. The responsibility would rest with her alone. No more hiding behind collective language, no more ambiguity about who made what call. From this point forward, every decision would have a face, a voice, and a clear line of accountability. And in a sport that just learned how costly the absence of accountability could be, that shift felt less like reform and more like a reckoning. Sue Bird's appointment instantly reframed the entire conversation because her credibility is unquestioned. She isn't respected because of one season or one headline. She's respected because she's lived every version of this sport. The grind when no one was watching, the pressure when everyone was, the balance between winning games and growing the audience. That perspective is exactly what was missing before. What separates Bird from the old structure is that she understands the modern game as a system, not just a scoreboard. She knows that star power doesn't dilute basketball integrity, it amplifies it. She's seen firsthand how one player can pull new eyes into the sport, create opportunity for teammates, and raise the ceiling for everyone involved. That's why her history with Caitlin Clark matters so much. While others questioned Clark's impact or tried to minimize it, Bird consistently acknowledged what was happening. She recognized that Clark's deep shooting wasn't just a skill, but a solution, a way to captivate audiences without relying on traditional highlights, a style that translated across age groups, borders, and casual fans who had never cared before. Bird never framed Clark as a distraction or a complication. She framed her as progress, as proof that women's basketball could evolve without losing its identity.
And that mindset is critical because it means popularity won't be treated like a threat under her leadership. It will be seen for what it actually is, an asset. With Bird in control, decisions won't be filtered through fear of headlines or protection of legacies. They'll be measured by impact, growth, and performance. And for a player like Caitlin Clark, that clarity changes everything. The timing of all this makes the stakes impossible to ignore. The next Olympics aren't overseas or tucked into an unfamiliar time zone. They're in Los Angeles, on home soil, in a city built for spectacle, storytelling, and global attention. For USA Basketball, it's the most valuable stage imaginable. By 2028, Caitlin Clark won't be an emerging name. She'll be a fully established force with years of professional experience and an international fan base that's already locked in. The audience that held signs in Paris won't need an introduction. They'll be watching on purpose. And this time, they'll expect to see her on the floor. That's what makes this moment feel like a second chance. The opportunity USA Basketball nearly wasted is now sitting right in front of them again, only bigger. A packed arena, massive television ratings, millions of casual viewers tuning in who might not watch another game all year. This is how stars become global icons and how sports cross into the mainstream for good. For Clark, the path is suddenly clear. No committee meetings behind closed doors, no vague criteria shifting depending on who's being evaluated. If she performs, she plays. That simplicity alone represents a dramatic change from what came before. And for the sport itself, the 2028 Olympics offer something even more important than medals: validation. Proof that women's basketball has entered an era where talent, visibility, and cultural impact can finally move in the same direction. An era where the biggest stage no longer ignores the biggest moment.
When you step back and look at everything that's happened, the pattern becomes impossible to deny. This wasn't one bad decision followed by bad luck. It was a system colliding with a future it refused to acknowledge. And once that collision happened, the fallout was inevitable. The people who believed they could preserve the old way of doing things learned a hard lesson. Women's basketball is no longer fighting to be noticed. It's being watched, analyzed, and invested in at a level it's never seen before. Decisions made in private rooms don't stay hidden anymore. And when they don't align with reality, the consequences arrive quickly. This restructuring isn't just about Caitlin Clark. It's about accountability finally catching up to leadership that had grown too comfortable. The committee model protected reputations, but it didn't protect the sport. Removing it sends a clear message. You either evolve with the game or the game moves on without you. Sue Bird represents that evolution, not just because of who she is, but because of what she understands. That growth and excellence aren't opposites, that star power can lift an entire ecosystem, that the future of women's basketball belongs to people willing to embrace change instead of fearing it. And as this new era takes shape, one thing is already clear. You can't ignore momentum, you can't dismiss the audience, and you definitely can't sideline the future and expect the system to survive. The old guard had its moment. Now the future is here, and it isn't waiting for permission.